All right, school is back in session. So whether you are remotely learning from home or you're stuck in a classroom somewhere 6 feet apart, just know that I'm here for you.
It's alive!
Today, we are going to be learning about the Articles of Confederation, which is the Constitution before the Constitution that most people think of. Baby Yoda. So I've got the new virtual classroom set up.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
We are ready to get started. Let's break down the Articles of Confederation.
To infinity and beyond!
Right now. Before we start talking about the Constitution of 1787, we want to look at that critical period of American history when we were actually governed by a document called the Articles of Confederation.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Articles of Confederation was adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777 and then eventually ratified in 1781. It was a document to try and organize the colonies, which would eventually we would call states, under one government that would be able to defeat the British and secure independence for America. Most of the Articles of Confederation were written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
Here's Johnny.
And what did he come up with? A firm league of friendship among the states.
We're friends to the end, remember?
Let's go take a look at some of the highlights and some of the weaknesses of the government that was created under this often overlooked document in American history. Two of the most important things that came out of the Articles of Confederation, other than winning the war, was how the new government would deal with territorial dispute. Remember, victory over the British meant that the United States gained all of the territory east of the Mississippi River, and that land was now up for grabs. Different states wanted to claim that land for themselves, like Virginia, like Pennsylvania. So one of the most important roles of Congress under the Articles of Confederation was settling these land disputes. Congress eventually passed a series of laws called ordinances, like the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Land Ordinance set up a scientific survey of the newly acquired land and set up a system of creating towns and providing people the opportunity to buy some of the land. Congress's power to regulate land comes from Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation. It reads, "The United States in Congress assembled shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of determining on peace and war, of establishing rules for deciding in all cases what captures on land or water shall be legal, and in what manner prizes taken by land or naval forces in the service of the United States shall be divided or appropriated." All controversies concerning the private right of soil claimed under different grants of two or more states, whose jurisdictions as they may respect such lands, and the states which pass such grants are adjusted. The said grants of either of them being at the same time claimed to have originated antecedent to such settlement of jurisdiction, shall on the petition of either party to the Congress of the United States be finally determined, as near as may be in the same manner as is before prescribed for deciding disputes respecting territorial jurisdiction between different states. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 took this to the next level. As these newly acquired territories began to grow in population, when they reached 5,000, they could start creating their own governments and be recognized as official territory. Once they grew to 60,000, they could then apply for statehood and start electing representatives and senators to Congress. Now let's take a look at some of the language in the Articles of Confederation that caused some of the problems. Some of the wording of the article clearly indicates a lack of confidence in a new national government. You can see throughout the articles where many of the powers that our government has today were not given to the newly created government in 1781. Article 1 reads, "The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America." Sounds pretty good, right? Article 2. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress Assembly. So you can see right there in Article 2 that it was the states that were worried about maintaining their own independence, their own power. In their eyes, a new, strong national government could trample on their rights just as easily as the British had done. Article 3. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them, or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatever. So there's that phrase, league of friendship. Doesn't really establish a strong unified front, does it?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
As you continue to read through the document, you'll notice that a lot of the weaknesses of the article weren't so much about the powers that were granted to the government as much as it was the powers that were lacking. For example, the government under the Articles of Confederation had no real way of collecting taxes from the state. They had no power to regulate trade or interstate commerce between the states. They had no president or no executive to enforce its laws. They had no national court system to settle disputes in a judicial manner. Lawmaking was extremely difficult because you needed 9 out of the 13 states to pass a law. Compare that to today, where you just need a simple majority.
On this vote, the yeas are 228, the nays are 187. The bill is passed.
And once the articles were ratified, it was virtually impossible to change them because it called for a unanimous vote in order to create any amendment. So even though the federal government under the article was given some power to do things like coin money, deal with foreign governments, create and break treaties with Native Americans, it lacked a lot of power to deal with domestic issues, to handle disputes between the states, to really unite the states together under a common government. It was almost like we had 13 separate governments trying to do their own thing. And eventually all of that would boil over into a series of violent protests throughout the country, the most famous of these being Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion was a series of protests and uprisings in Massachusetts where farmers felt like they weren't getting a fair deal from their government. Many of those farmers were losing their land due to foreclosure.
Now that there's no more soldiers to feed, I can't sell my produce. And instead of helping me who helped you, you make me sell my farm to pay my debts. And when the money from the sale doesn't cover my debts, you throw me in a cage. Me and darn near every other farmer in Massachusetts. We risked our lives fighting for your freedom.
By 1787, things got so bad that Shays led an armed revolt on a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was eventually put down, but it sent shockwaves through the country that something needed to change. And that's what ultimately led to calls for a constitutional convention that would change the course of American history forever. In what would turn out to be a prophetic letter from Henry Knox to George Washington, Henry Knox explained, "We imagine that the mildness of our government and the virtue of the people were so correspondent, that we were not as other nations requiring brutal force to support the laws, but we find that we are men, actual men possessing all the turbulent passions belonging to that animal, and that we must have a government proper and adequate for him." So finally, in the summer of 1787, delegates were called to meet in Philadelphia at what will be known as the Constitutional Convention to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation. It would go from a loose confederation of states to a truly united states, bound together under a new constitution and governed with a national legislative, executive, and judicial system. How did they do it? Well, that'll be the topic of our next episode.
Wakanda forever!
Thanks for watching.